The first time the police lights flashed across my driveway, I thought it had to be a mistake. After all, I had only lived in this neighborhood for 3 weeks, kept to myself, and followed every written rule the HOA provided. But apparently, that wasn't enough for our HOA president, a woman everyone quietly called Karen, long before I ever moved in. She didn't just enforce rules, she hunted for them, twisting every guideline into a weapon she could swing at anyone who didn't bow to her authority. So when she stormed onto my property, screaming about violations that didn't exist, I knew something was off. But I didn't yet understand how far she was willing to push things. Not until she called the police on me twice in the same week. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that her attempt to flex her power was about to collide head-on with the one force she never expected to challenge. Because she hadn't just targeted another homeowner. She had picked a fight with the FBI, and the moment she realized it, everything began to unravel. So the question is, how far did she go before her world finally collapsed? When I first moved into Willow Ridge, I thought I had finally found the one quiet place in the world where nothing and no one would bother me. After years of high-pressure assignments, relocations, and nights spent in unfamiliar safe houses, all I wanted was a neighborhood where the loudest sound I'd hear at night was a lawn sprinkler or the hum of someone's garage door closing. Willow Ridge had that kind of stillness, rows of manicured lawns, identical mailbox posts, and the kind of clean sidewalks that looked like they'd never known an unplanned scuff mark. It felt peaceful, almost unnaturally so, the sort of place where people waved at strangers simply because that's what people there were supposed to do. I bought the house at the end of a cul-de-sac, surrounded by tall maple trees that cast long shadows across the street in the late afternoon. I remembered standing in the empty living room on my first day, the air still smelling faintly of fresh paint, and thinking this might actually be perfect. For once, there would be no briefing folders spread across my kitchen table, no nervous glances out the window, no coded phone calls that couldn't be ignored. Just quiet, normalcy, a place where I could exhale. My work, or at least the part of it I was allowed to acknowledge, required long stretches of calm between moments of extreme pressure. Willow Ridge was supposed to be the calm. Neighbors walked their dogs at predictable hours. Kids rode their bikes in small clusters, drifting from driveway to driveway. Retirees tended to their flower beds with the kind of pride that suggested the begonias themselves were homeowners. Everything was orderly, consistent, controlled. The HOA, from what little I understood of it at first, was a big part of that. They had rules, sure, pages and pages of perfectly typed expectations about paint colors, mailbox designs, acceptable lawn heights, parking schedules, trash bin placement, and more. But I assumed those rules were no more than neat guidelines people like to pin on their refrigerators but rarely read. I had no idea then just how much power certain people in Willow Ridge believed those rules gave them. During my first week, I kept to myself, unpacking carefully, taking early morning runs through the neighborhood, learning the rhythm of the street. I noticed early on that there was one house, the one 3 lots down, where the blinds always twitched a little too quickly whenever someone walked by. A white SUV parked rigidly in the driveway, always at the same angle, as if even the vehicle knew better than to challenge the household's sense of order. And the woman who lived there, though I didn't know her name yet, had a reputation that seemed to follow her like a silent introduction. Every person I met mentioned her in the same lowered tone, with the same careful phrasing. "That's our HOA president, she means well," or "she takes the HOA responsibilities seriously," which is what people say when they want you to know someone is a problem without actually saying it. At the time, I brushed it off. I had no reason to worry about an HOA or its president. I had read the rules, I had followed them. Everything about my move was discreet, clean, and by the book, exactly the way it needed to be. Besides, I wasn't trying to draw attention. I went to work quietly. I came home quietly. I spent my evenings unpacking boxes that held years of life lived out of necessity, not comfort. Nothing about me screamed trouble, but early signs of tension were already forming around the edges of my days. Little things that didn't feel like anything at the time, but became clearer in hindsight, like the way the president's SUV slowed down the first time she drove past my house, even though she had no stop sign to obey, or how she stood at the end of my driveway one morning while I was jogging back home, pretending to check her phone but really scanning my property line like she was measuring something. She didn't wave, she didn't smile. She just stared, long enough to make the scene feel off, long enough to make me wonder what exactly she was looking for. Neighbors mentioned her more often than I expected. They talked about how she had once fined someone for having a wreath that wasn't seasonally appropriate, or how she sent warnings to a couple who left their trash bin out 3 hours past the acceptable window. There were stories about her taking photos of people's yards, standing uncomfortably close to their property lines, or calling emergency services for suspicious activity when a teenager's car backfired. I listened, but I didn't think much of it. I had spent years dealing with people who were far worse than a strict HOA president. I wasn't about to lose sleep over her. Still, those small incidents built a faint tension in the back of my mind, like a pressure drop before a storm. Nothing serious, nothing worth reacting to, but enough to make me pay attention. My daily routine settled in smoothly. Wake up early, run work, return home before sunset. I became familiar with the soft evening glow on the cold sack and how the neighborhood lights flickered on one by one. I cooked simple meals and kept my blinds half open just to let myself feel part of a normal, quiet community. It felt stable, something I hadn't had in a long time, something I didn't realize I had missed until I began to feel it again. But beneath that peaceful surface, something was brewing. I didn't know it then, but the HOA president had started asking questions about me. Not friendly ones. Not the kind neighbors ask because they're curious about their new resident. These were questions layered with suspicion, assumptions, and her own need for authority. She wanted to know where I worked, why I was rarely home during the day, why I had moved in so quietly, why no one had properly greeted me yet. The answers to those questions weren't hers to know, and maybe that was the beginning of the problem. Because in a neighborhood like Willow Ridge, where routine was everything and every deviation from the expected rhythm stood out like an untrimmed hedge, I was a question she couldn't answer. And for someone like her, someone used to control, that was unacceptable. Still, conflict hadn't arrived yet. Not officially. Instead, the air simply grew heavier with unspoken curiosity and quiet watching. I could feel eyes on me at times, just a little too long, just a little too often. But life remained calm enough that I didn't give it much thought. I focused on settling in, organizing the parts of my life that could be organized, and appreciating the rare stretch of normalcy I had found. But normalcy has a way of cracking at the edges when someone pushes too hard. And the HOA president, the woman the neighborhood called Karen, long before the rest of the world adopted the term, was already preparing to push. She just hadn't made her move yet. And when she finally did, the quiet life I had built in Willow Ridge would come crashing into a storm of accusations, harassment, and escalating chaos, all because she couldn't stand not knowing exactly who I was, or the truth she would eventually discover. The first official notice arrived like a small, polite whisper, but it carried a weight that made the ground feel unsteady beneath my feet. A crisp, printed envelope from the HOA, tucked neatly under my front doormat, its edges perfectly straight, the paper thick and unyielding. I tore it open, expecting perhaps a friendly reminder or a mundane request about lawn maintenance. Instead, the words leapt off the page with a precision that only someone obsessed with control could achieve. Violation of HOA Rule 14b, unauthorized landscaping modifications. I blinked at the description, trying to reconcile it with my yard. I had done nothing beyond planting a few seasonal flowers, the kind recommended at the local garden center, all perfectly symmetrical, nothing messy, nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, according to this notice, I had committed a grievous offense. I spent the next hour inspecting every corner of the property, every blade of grass, every flower bed, every stone edging I had so carefully positioned. There was nothing out of place, at least nothing that any reasonable person could find fault with. And yet, the notice insisted I must correct the unauthorized modifications, or face escalating fines. I considered ignoring it, but a subtle, knowing unease told me this was only the beginning. The very next morning, while I was outside measuring the angle of the driveway for some minor maintenance work, I felt a presence behind me. I turned, and there she was, the HOA president, standing near the edge of my property, clipboard in hand, her expression unreadable but unmistakably scrutinizing. "Good morning," she said, her tone polite but clipped. I offered a cautious greeting in return. She didn't smile. She didn't move. She simply tilted her head, as if examining every line and shadow of my property, as though it were an art piece she had the authority to condemn. I wanted to ask her what she was doing, why she was here, but something about her posture, The sharp precision of her observation held me back. I nodded instead, a silent acknowledgement of her inspection. And then she left without a word, walking down the street with the deliberate slowness of someone who knew they were leaving a mark on my day, even if only in my mind. Within a week, the violations continued to pile up. Notices arrived in neat stacks, each accusing me of some minor infringement that seemed to exist only in the imagination of the HOA president. Trash cannot fully retracted within allowed time frame. Mailbox orientation incorrect. Window blinds partially raised outside of acceptable hours. Each notice was signed with a flourish, a reminder of authority that seemed almost theatrical. It wasn't just rules enforcement, it was harassment disguised as administration. I found myself tiptoeing around my own home, measuring distances with a tape, timing the placement of trash bins down to the minute, adjusting blinds with military precision. Then came the first confrontation. I had been outside trimming a bush when she drove up in her white SUV, stopping at the end of my driveway. She stepped out, her heels clicking against the pavement like a metronome counting down an invisible deadline. "I noticed your hedge is overgrown," she said, her tone neutral, but there was an undercurrent, a steel hidden beneath civility. I looked at the hedge, a small, unassuming row of boxwoods, and replied that it was within the guidelines provided in the HOA handbook. She shook her head slowly, pointing to a single branch that had grown slightly past an imaginary line. "This is unacceptable," she said. "You will need to correct it immediately." I took a deep breath, explaining that I had followed every written rule, and that the branch in question was well within acceptable limits. But she didn't listen. She simply wrote something on her clipboard and left, leaving me standing there with a tightening knot of anger and helplessness. It wasn't the branch, it wasn't even the notice itself, it was the principle of it. The idea that someone could exert such control over a property I had legally purchased, turning every choice I made into a potential violation. Over the next few weeks, the harassment escalated. The notices grew more frequent and absurd. One accused me of excessive noise at precisely 8:03 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, a time when the only sound had been the humming of my refrigerator. Another claimed I had left my recycling bin too far from curbside. I began to take photos of my property daily, documenting every inch of the yard, driveway, and home exterior, building a silent archive to prove I had done nothing wrong. But even as I documented, I could feel her eyes on me, a constant invisible surveillance that turned my peaceful haven into a pressure cooker. Things became even stranger when small acts of sabotage began appearing. My garden gnomes, which I had placed neatly along the flower beds, were moved overnight. My welcome mat, once centered perfectly, was found skewed at a bizarre angle that violated some imaginary symmetry. Trash bins were tipped slightly, doors left ajar, small signs moved. At first, I thought these might be coincidences, but the frequency and timing of each incident became too deliberate to ignore. Each act seemed designed to unsettle me, to create anxiety in a place that was supposed to feel safe. Neighbors started whispering, their glances full of curiosity and caution. Some offered sympathetic smiles, others avoided eye contact entirely, as if acknowledging my presence, or my predicament, might somehow drag them into the storm. I didn't blame them. She had built a network of influence, subtle and pervasive, that made people hesitant to cross her. Everyone wanted peace. Everyone wanted stability. But her idea of stability involved controlling every moment, every choice, every expression of independence in the neighborhood. The first real escalation occurred when she called the police. The details were ridiculous, almost laughable in hindsight. But at the time, the tension was unbearable. She reported a suspicious vehicle. My car, which had been parked legally in my driveway, locked and entirely innocuous. Officers arrived within minutes, their flashlights sweeping over my property as I explained the situation calmly. "It's my property," I said. "I live here. Everything is perfectly legal." The officers nodded politely, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. They didn't know me. They didn't know that every document I had, every signature and deed, was above reproach. They only knew there had been a complaint. And that complaint carried her authority, her presence, her insistence that something was amiss. After that day, the harassment intensified. Notices now arrived multiple times per week, some even hand-delivered by her. Each one was more intricate than the last, citing rules I had never even known existed, often contradicting previous communications. One notice demanded I remove unauthorized decorative stones, while another insisted I add appropriate seasonal decor. The instructions were mutually exclusive. Compliance became impossible. Every attempt to satisfy her demands created new violations. It was a game designed for me to fail. Meanwhile, small, seemingly random incidents continued to unsettle me. My mail was occasionally delayed or misplaced. Minor damage appeared on the property, and once in the middle of a quiet evening, I found my driveway spray painted with an arrow pointing toward my house. No signature. No message beyond the implicit threat. I began installing security cameras, but even those did little to alleviate the unease. I knew I was being watched, monitored, measured at every step, and there was no escaping the scrutiny. Tension bled into every aspect of life. Simple routines became fraught with stress. Going outside felt like navigating a minefield. Mail delivery, trash collection, even opening the front door carried the potential for confrontation. Every interaction with neighbors became a careful calculation. What could be said? What could be implied? How to avoid further notice or complaint? I had moved into a neighborhood that appeared idyllic, but was in reality a battlefield where control was the only currency, and I had unknowingly entered into a conflict I could not yet see. By the third month, the situation reached a breaking point. I returned home one evening to find a handwritten note pinned to my front door. HOA rules are not suggestions. Compliance is expected. No signature, just the unmistakable tone of authority. I considered confronting her directly, but the memory of the police visit and the invisible network of influence she had built through fear and reputation made me hesitate. It wasn't just her power. It was the compliance she had cultivated in the neighborhood. Anyone who crossed her risked isolation, scrutiny, and escalation. That week, a new tactic emerged. Small, personal items began disappearing: garden tools, outdoor decorations, even packages left on the porch. Each loss was carefully calculated, small enough to appear accidental, large enough to send a message. The cumulative effect was psychological. I felt unsafe in my own home, anxious even while performing mundane tasks. She wasn't just enforcing rules, she was breaking them herself, manipulating the environment to assert dominance. Legal attempts yielded frustrating results. I contacted the HOA board, submitting evidence of compliance and requesting clarity on each violation. Responses were delayed, vague, or dismissive. When I finally received replies, they often contradicted one another or introduced new infractions. It became clear that no amount of compliance would satisfy her. The goal was control, not fairness. Amid the growing tension, I noticed subtle alliances forming in the neighborhood. A few residents expressed support quietly, hinting at similar experiences but reluctant to speak openly. Others remained silent, fearful of drawing attention. I realized I was not alone, but I was isolated enough to remain the primary target of her escalating tactics. The tipping point arrived unexpectedly. One morning, I discovered a formal notice stapled to my garage door, a demand to appear at an emergency HOA meeting. The notice was aggressive, accusatory, and filled with procedural jargon that suggested serious consequences. Failure to attend, it claimed, would result in fines, legal action, and potential liens against my property. My chest tightened as I read the words. This was no longer mere harassment. This was an organized, deliberate attack on my right to live in my home without interference. I spent the day preparing, gathering documentation, photographing every corner of my property, compiling proof of compliance with every cited rule. The hours stretched into an anxious blur, and yet, as I stood at my front door ready to leave, I realized that attending the meeting would place me directly into her web. The web she had woven over months of scrutiny, manipulation, and intimidation. That night, I sat in my living room, watching the quiet street outside, knowing she was somewhere watching, waiting, calculating her next move. Each shadow, each passing car, each distant click or creak became amplified in my mind. The harassment had become a living thing, breathing, evolving, and relentless. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that this wasn't the end. This wasn't even close to the end. It was the moment before the storm, the build-up before the confrontation that would expose everything, test every ounce of patience and skill, and force her, and the entire neighborhood, to realize that I was not merely a compliant homeowner. I was prepared, I was observant, and the rules of this neighborhood, the rules she believed she controlled, were about to collide with a force she could never anticipate. Every notice, every intrusion, every petty violation had been leading to this. And when it came, she wouldn't just be surprised. She would be completely unprepared for the truth that waited quietly beneath the surface, ready to turn the tables in a way she could never have imagined. And as the last light faded behind the maple trees, and the sack settled into the deceptive calm of early evening, I knew one thing for certain: the rising tension, the harassment, and the absurdity of her power were about to meet their match, because she had no idea who she was really challenging. And the moment she did, everything would change. The day of the confrontation arrived quietly, deceptively so, as if the neighborhood itself held its breath, waiting for the inevitable. I had prepared meticulously, knowing that the build-up over months of harassment, scrutiny, and petty violations would culminate in this single, decisive moment. Every notice, every intrusive glance, every hand-delivered demand had been recorded, photographed, and cataloged. I knew the rules better than she did, and I knew how far she had overstepped the bounds of her authority. What she did not yet realize was that her obsession with control had created a situation she could never manage once the truth emerged. I parked my car carefully at the edge of the cul-de-sac, surveying the empty street and the neatly aligned houses, all seemingly asleep, unaware of the storm about to erupt. The HOA had scheduled the meeting in the community clubhouse, a small, innocuous building at the center of Willow Ridge, but for me it was ground zero. I stepped inside, carrying the weight of every slight, every intimidation tactic, every letter that had piled up like bricks against the door of my life. The air inside the clubhouse was thick with the scent of polished wood and stale coffee. Chairs were arranged in tight rows, the fluorescent lights harsh, exposing every wrinkle in the fabric of authority she had tried to weave. She was already there, standing at the head of the room, clipboard in hand, the same expression she had worn during my first run in on the driveway months ago. That cold, measured stare, the kind that made people shift uncomfortably in their seats, had been her weapon. But today she faced me, not a distant, compliant homeowner, but someone who had studied the rules, documented every infraction, and was prepared to respond. I could feel the tension radiating from her, a mix of indignation, disbelief, and barely contained panic. She had no idea that everything she thought was hidden or manipulative would now be exposed in front of the people she had long assumed would support her unconditionally. The meeting began with formalities, the usual pleasantries that thinly veiled the real purpose: to assert her dominance, to humiliate me, and to reinforce the message that no deviation from her interpretation of the HOA rules would be tolerated. She spoke first, her voice calm but sharp, listing violations, fines, and threats of legal action. I listened quietly, taking mental notes, watching the way her words hung in the air, observing the slight twitch in her hand when she mentioned penalties I had already documented as unjustified. Then came the first attempt at intimidation. She presented what she called evidence of unauthorized modifications, photographs that supposedly showed me in violation of landscaping and exterior regulations. As she clicked through each image, I noticed subtle manipulations. Angles altered, timestamps misleading, exaggerations that only someone inexperienced with property documentation could miss. I leaned forward, calm but firm, and began presenting my counter-evidence. Every photograph I had taken, every dated note, every documented communication with the HOA was laid out systematically. The room shifted, chairs creaked. Neighbors leaned forward, curiosity growing into a tangible tension that seemed to pulse in the air. She tried to interrupt, claiming some technicality that would invalidate my evidence, but I had anticipated her moves. Each objection was countered with precise references to the HOA bylaws, state property laws, and even case precedents I had researched in advance. Her composure faltered for the first time. There was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She realized she was no longer controlling the narrative. I was, and for someone who had built their authority on fear and unquestioned compliance, that uncertainty was dangerous. Then the psychological twist. I revealed the first piece of information she never saw coming. Calmly, I mentioned the surveillance cameras, strategically placed not just on my property but capturing the common areas surrounding her own home. She froze, the clipboard dropping slightly in her hand. The room felt heavier, the neighbors' glances sharpening. I had evidence not just of her harassment of me, but subtle violations she had committed herself, blocking common pathways, improperly disposing of garden waste, and subtly intimidating other residents. Every documented act of abuse that had gone unnoticed until now would be visible. The room erupted into murmurs, the kind that start as whispers and crescendo into a low roar of tension. She attempted to regain control, but each attempt fell flat against the weight of irrefutable proof. My documentation was complete, methodical, and impossible to ignore. I watched as the carefully cultivated image of authority she had built over years began to crumble in real time. The letters, the fines, the inspections, All of it now painted her as someone abusing her power, rather than enforcing it. The peak of the confrontation arrived when she attempted to escalate further, shouting that I was intimidating the HOA and undermining neighborhood standards. I responded calmly, narrating each event, each violation, and each act of harassment with precise dates and evidence. When I revealed that I had compiled a legal report notarized showing that many of her actions could be considered harassment under state law, the room went silent. Even her allies in the HO board shifted uncomfortably, realizing that they were caught between her escalating obsession and the clear, documented truth I presented. Her panic became visible. She faltered mid-sentence, her tone wavering, and for a moment, she looked like the neighbor everyone had quietly feared. A human exposed, fallible, and trapped by her own obsession. She had relied on fear and silence to maintain control, but now, under the scrutiny of evidence, witnesses, and my deliberate composure, her authority disintegrated. The climax reached its peak when I calmly presented the final, decisive twist. I mentioned the nature of my work, not to boast, not to intimidate, but to clarify the reality she had so violently underestimated. I explained, indirectly at first, that her escalation against me had involved local authorities, legal notices, and threats, and then, in a measured tone, I revealed the critical fact. Her actions had inadvertently crossed a line she could never have anticipated. Her complaint to the police, her repeated harassment, and her attempts to manipulate neighborhood perception had all led to the involvement of federal oversight, the kind of scrutiny that makes even the most confident local authority reconsider every move. The room froze. The neighbors, the HOA board members, even the clerk recording the meeting all felt the weight of the revelation. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. She realized fully that the battle she had waged so meticulously, believing herself untouchable, was now on a scale she could not control. Her eyes darted around, seeking support, pleading silently, but the tide had turned. Every subtle act of intimidation she had deployed now reflected back upon her, magnified, undeniable. I concluded my presentation with one final, deliberate point. Every threat, every fine, every act of harassment had been documented, and every attempt to intimidate me would be reflected in the official record. I made no dramatic gestures, no loud proclamations. The calm certainty in my voice carried far more weight than any shouting could have. It was the voice of someone who had been underestimated for too long, who had endured months of absurd, petty tyranny, and who now held all the leverage she had assumed she owned. Her collapse was subtle, yet undeniable. The once imposing figure of authority slumped slightly, her shoulders losing the rigidity that had defined her posture for months. She stammered through a few half-hearted protests, but the weight of evidence, the room's collective awareness, and the undeniable proof of her overreach silenced her completely. Even the board members who had previously nodded politely now avoided eye contact, their expressions a mixture of guilt, realization, and a dawning understanding that they had allowed her behavior to go unchecked. For the first time, I felt the shift in power, not just in the room, but in the neighborhood itself. The fear she had wielded as a weapon began to dissipate. The neighbors, once quiet and cautious, exchanged subtle glances, whispers of solidarity emerging. The narrative that had painted me as a target was now reversed. She was the center of scrutiny, her credibility eroding with each passing second. And yet, the climax wasn't only about public humiliation. It was about the legal precision that ensured her overreach could not be repeated. I had prepared formal notices to the HOA board, outlining potential violations of federal harassment statutes and property rights infringements. I had also included the documentation necessary to protect my property and ensure that future attempts to intimidate or enforce absurd fines would be nullified. Every step of this confrontation had been calculated to secure a decisive outcome, a complete reversal of the imbalance of power that had ruled the neighborhood for far too long. As the meeting drew to a close, she slumped completely, her composure gone, replaced by a raw, unfiltered panic. I left the room with my evidence intact, my rights secured, and the neighborhood now quietly acknowledging the shift in authority. She remained, caught in the aftermath of her own actions, unable to reconcile the image of control she had cultivated with the reality that it had crumbled in a single, meticulously prepared confrontation. And as I stepped outside into the cool evening air, I knew the final phase of this ordeal was approaching, the resolution, the long-term consequences, and the emotional closure that would not only cement the victory but also leave a lasting mark on Willow Ridge. The storm of harassment had ended, but the ripples of its impact were only beginning to settle. Because while the HOA president had lost control in that moment, the neighborhood would remember. And the question lingered in the air, heavy and unresolved: how would she respond now, when the truth of her overreach had finally come to light, and the homeowners she had tried to dominate were no longer afraid? The days after the confrontation unfolded with a strange combination of relief and vigilance. The weight that had pressed on my shoulders for months, the constant scrutiny, the petty harassment, the intrusive inspections, and the absurd fines, was finally lifted, but the echoes of what had transpired lingered. I returned home each evening to a quiet street that seemed unchanged at first glance, the houses perfectly aligned, lawns meticulously kept, and neighbors going about their routines. Yet beneath that superficial calm, a subtle shift had occurred. The balance of power had changed. The HOA president, the woman who had cast herself as the omnipotent enforcer of Willow Ridge, now moved through the neighborhood with a careful, almost wary step. She had been stripped of the invisible authority she once wielded, replaced by the tangible awareness that her actions had consequences, and that her tyranny could be exposed in ways she could not control. In the immediate aftermath, the HOA board scrambled to recover from the shock of the meeting. Notices that had once arrived in neatly stamped envelopes now came with cautious phrasing, tentative corrections, and, in many cases, silence. The board members, previously complicit through inaction, began quietly acknowledging their overreach and the mistakes of blind compliance. Some reached out to me, cautiously, seeking clarification and understanding. I engaged politely, ensuring that the dialogue remained professional and documented, but my tone carried the firmness of someone who had endured months of harassment and had emerged not just unbroken but prepared to protect themselves from future violations. The neighbors, too, began to react in subtle yet meaningful ways. Those who had once whispered quietly behind closed doors now approached with a mix of relief and cautious curiosity. Conversations that had been tinged with fear now carried an undercurrent of camaraderie. People shared experiences that mirrored mine, instances of minor fines, intrusive inspections, and the silent pressure of living under the watchful eye of the HOA president. The realization that she had been acting excessively, targeting multiple residents for control rather than legitimate concerns, spread slowly but unmistakably through the community. This acknowledgement did not come with loud confrontations or dramatic displays. Instead, it manifested in quiet gestures: neighbors leaving their trash bins out a little longer without fear, adjusting their landscaping with confidence, and reclaiming small freedoms that had been subtly suppressed for months. I also began noticing the first tangible effects of the legal documentation I had prepared. The letters, photographs, and official reports I had compiled during the months of harassment were now being used to redefine boundaries. Any future attempt by the HOA president to levy fines or enforce arbitrary rules against me was automatically countered by a pre-established legal precedent, reinforced with documentation and procedural clarity. For the first time, I felt a genuine sense of security in my own home, not just physical safety, but the knowledge that my rights were respected, protected, and verifiable. One of the most satisfying aspects of the resolution, however, was not just the legal or procedural vindication but the social and psychological impact on the HOA president herself. In the weeks that followed, her demeanor shifted in subtle yet unmistakable ways. The authoritative stance she had relied upon so heavily became faltering, tentative. She was no longer the unchallenged enforcer of rules. Every glance from residents carried the silent reminder of her overreach, the incontrovertible fact that her actions had been observed, documented, and exposed. I watched as she attempted to reassert herself in small ways, adjusting signage, attending meetings with cautious formality. But each action was met with the subtle but firm awareness of the community that her power had been diminished. Her world had collapsed in the precise way that months of meticulous documentation, patient observation, and calm confrontation had orchestrated. Interestingly, the experience left a lasting mark on the community culture itself. The HOA, once an instrument of fear and micromanagement, began a slow transformation. New policies were introduced, emphasizing transparency, documentation, and fairness. Neighbors were encouraged to communicate openly without fear of arbitrary retaliation. The leadership structure of the HOA was quietly recalibrated to prevent a single individual from exercising unchecked authority. While it was not a perfect system, it was a system informed by accountability rather than intimidation, and it was a direct result of the confrontation and the deliberate measures I had taken to ensure that the truth could no longer be suppressed. On a personal level, the resolution brought a profound sense of closure. The months of tension, sleepless nights, and constant vigilance had taken their toll, yet emerging on the other side imparted a renewed sense of confidence and clarity. I realized that boundaries, whether personal, social, or legal, are only as strong as the enforcement of one's own principles. In the process of asserting my rights, documenting abuses, and confronting harassment with patience and precision, I had learned not just how to defend myself, but how to reshape the environment to prevent future overreach. It was a lesson that extended beyond property lines into every aspect of life. Preparation, patience, and meticulous attention to detail are powerful tools in the face of arbitrary authority. Perhaps the most ironic consequence of the ordeal was the reversal of perception within the neighborhood. The HOA president, who had once been viewed by some as a model of diligence and authority, became in subtle ways a cautionary example of the dangers of obsession and unchecked power. Conversations in casual settings shifted. Residents would recount her overreach with a mixture of disbelief and quiet amusement, often pausing to reflect on the absurdity of her demands. What had been a source of fear became, in retrospect, a source of humor and relief. The social dynamics had transformed. The community now recognized the importance of balance, fairness, and the limits of individual authority. The personal impact on me was equally notable. The confrontation and subsequent resolution reinforced the value of strategic patience and resilience. I realized that enduring harassment does not mean passivity. Rather, it involves careful observation, documentation, and timing. The months of rising tension, the careful collection of evidence, and the deliberate preparation for confrontation had culminated in a decisive outcome that not only protected my property rights but reshaped the broader community dynamics. I felt a deep sense of empowerment, a reassurance that rational, methodical action can dismantle even the most persistent attempts at control. Legally, the aftermath also brought significant clarity. The HOA, having witnessed the exposure of arbitrary enforcement and harassment, began implementing stricter guidelines for notice delivery, violation documentation, and appeals processes. Any future disputes would be conducted with transparency, accountability, and clear procedural rules. This structural change, born from months of conflict and one decisive confrontation, represented a tangible long-term consequence that would protect not only me, but every resident of Willow Ridge moving forward. The environment of intimidation had been replaced by one of cautious respect, informed by the awareness that authority is contingent upon fairness and verifiable adherence to rules. In addition, the social cohesion of the neighborhood strengthened in ways that were subtle but profound. Residents who had previously avoided interactions with the HOA president or each other began to engage more openly. Informal gatherings became more common. Discussions about shared concerns about rules and property management were normalized, and a quiet sense of community oversight emerged. The collective memory of the confrontation served as a reminder that cooperation, vigilance, and mutual support could prevent the return of arbitrary power. The irony was not lost on me. The very tactics intended to isolate and intimidate me ultimately strengthened communal bonds and fostered an environment of collective accountability. Emotionally, the resolution provided a rare opportunity for reflection. The months of tension and harassment had forced me to confront the limits of patience, the necessity of meticulous planning, and the power of calm assertiveness. It became clear that fear, while a potent tool in the hands of those who abuse authority, can be neutralized through preparedness and clarity of action. The HOA president's downfall was not the result of chance or luck. It was the consequence of sustained observation, documentation, and principled confrontation. This realization offered a deeper sense of satisfaction than mere victory. It was an affirmation of the effectiveness of methodical, deliberate action in restoring justice. As the neighborhood slowly returned to a rhythm that was familiar yet fundamentally altered, I found myself appreciating aspects of Willow Ridge I had previously taken for granted. The quiet evenings, once shadowed by subtle fear, now felt genuinely peaceful. I could enjoy simple routines without the constant mental calculations required to avoid imagined violations. Gardening, parking, and even leaving the house felt like normal, human activities rather than calculated maneuvers under the gaze of a self-appointed enforcer. Freedom, in its small but tangible form, had been reclaimed. The HOA president, for her part, became a figure of quiet notoriety. She no longer commanded rooms with the same presence, and her attempts at influence were met with polite but firm resistance. Her previous allies in the board had recalibrated their approach, mindful of the documentation and legal measures that ensured her actions could no longer remain unchecked. There was a subtle, enduring lesson for everyone involved: authority without accountability is fragile, and control built on fear is temporary. Ultimately, the story of the confrontation and its resolution became more than a personal victory. It became a narrative that resonated throughout the community. Residents shared their experiences with neighbors, and the tale of the months-long harassment, meticulous documentation, and eventual triumph became a cautionary legend. It was a reminder of the importance of vigilance, the power of preparation, and the ultimate necessity of confronting injustice with clarity and composure. The irony of the situation, the poetic justice of a tyrant undone by the very systems she sought to manipulate, was not lost on anyone. As weeks turned into months, the neighborhood settled into a stable, equitable pattern. Fines were issued only when objectively warranted, inspections were conducted transparently, and the collective memory of the ordeal ensured that no single individual could dominate with unchecked authority again. I continued my life with a renewed sense of security and confidence, aware that the months of struggle had not only protected my rights but reshaped the community for the better. The tension, fear, and frustration had transformed into empowerment, clarity, and cohesion. And as I looked out over the quiet cul-de-sac, the evening light casting long shadows over neatly kept lawns, I realized that the true victory was not only in reclaiming my home, but in restoring a sense of justice and fairness that had been absent for far too long. The HOA president's world had collapsed under the weight of her own overreach, but the community emerged stronger, wiser, and more resilient. So, the next time someone in your neighborhood tries to wield authority unchecked, or attempts to intimidate with rules and fines that stretch beyond reason, remember this story. Document everything, stay calm, act strategically, and ensure that truth and evidence guide your response. Because in the end, power built on fear cannot withstand the light of preparation, patience, and principle. And now, I leave you with this question: if you had been in my shoes, facing a relentless HOA tyrant, how would you have responded? And what would you have done differently to protect yourself and your home?